welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're here with Tomas Coates Ulrichsen from the Policy Evidence Unit for University Commercialisation and Innovation, funded by Research England, and we have Rhys Perry from Research England with us here today too. So this webinar was convened arising from a discussion we had at our pre-Christmas HIFE accountability discussion, where Tomas pointed to this paper that he'd written considering the various inputs to and outputs from knowledge exchange which relate to economic growth in a kind of broadly defined. So we agreed at that webinar it'd be useful to explore the model in a little more depth and hear from Tomas on that, because we felt that it was a useful way to support you when you're thinking about knowledge exchange and writing accountability statements. But we must emphasise that this is not about HIFE specifically, and Tomas is presenting the report as a standalone initiative. So Rhys is here. He's going to just say a few words before Tomas starts to kind of set the Research England context. Any questions about HIFE and HIFE accountability specifically may be answered by Rhys in the chat or in the Q&A, or he may take them offline and we'll ask him to look at them later. So without further ado, I think that's all the notices I need to give you. We are being recorded. Slides will be shared afterwards. I will put a link to the actual report in the chat so you can go and read it later if you haven't, or you can go and reread it later in the light of Tomas's comments. But yes, we'll get underway. Rhys, shall I come to you first? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tamsin, and thanks. I guess first of all, thanks to KUK for organising these events, and Tomas both for your work on the framework and for kind of taking time to do this event. I think hopefully it'll be very, very useful. As Tamsin said, I'm Rhys Perry. I'm head of knowledge exchange, data and evidence at Research England. So have involvement with kind of leading HIFE and the review process at the moment. As mentioned, I'll just be giving a very brief introduction here to provide some context for Tomas's work on the framework. So in DCIT's annual kind of guidance letter to Research England on our funding allocations for 25-26, we were given the directive that high funding activities should support the government priority of kickstarting economic growth. We're aware that kind of HIFE supports a broad scope of KE modalities within universities, and we have strong evidence that it already is providing kind of economic impact, with the most recent ROI analysis gave a kind of greater than £14 per pound investment figure. I guess we see that the directive is to kind of build on this success by focusing that from 2026, all HIFE funding should be utilised towards the government priority of growth to kind of maximise this contribution. That being said, the framing of the economic growth mission from the government is very broad. It's about kind of improving the prosperity of the country, but also the kind of living standards for more people, making sure that growth is felt by all across the country in all areas, all situations. And we're aware that kind of knowledge exchange can achieve economic growth in many different ways, and these can be kind of very direct, delivering kind of short-term benefits, more commercialization focused activities spring to mind, but they can also be kind of more direct, building those partnerships that might not have an initial kind of economic impact, but kind of can grow relationships with other civic actors and can lead to cluster formation within a particular area, for instance, that then kind of provides longer term growth. These kind of both indirect and direct kind of contributions are eligible for HIFE support kind of moving forward. What we've changed our focus around is just making sure that there are clear pathways between the use of funds at institutions and how this supports the economic growth mission. I guess an additional point is just the principle kind of across dual support that holds true in HIFE, that institutions are best placed to decide how funds are spent to achieve desired outcomes. It's our responsibility to kind of set what those outcomes are, but we kind of give the responsibility onto providers to kind of utilize that in the best way, aligning their own specialist strengths, their strategic objectives, local priorities, taking all that context into mind when they're thinking about how their distinctive offering for kind of delivering the greatest benefit towards economic growth. With kind of that context in mind, we set out to try to provide a better articulation through which economic growth can be achieved for university knowledge exchange activities, and this is why we kind of originally commissioned Tomas to do and the UCI to do this piece of work, creating this framework, but asked him to do that at a kind of high level, exploring kind of all of universities' knowledge exchange work, not just HIFE. It is kind of broader than that. It's a kind of independent view from Tomas in terms of what that looks like, what the pathways to growth outcomes can be at universities, and that will kind of lead to kind of national economic growth overall, I guess. Yeah, I'll pass to Tomas now then to just kind of talk through the framework in more detail. And as Tamsin said, obviously the focus of the session is around kind of Tomas's framework, but I can kind of offline answer any questions that might be related to HIFE specifically.
Great, thanks very much, Rhys and Tamsin, for those introductions. I'm waiting for, can everyone see the screen yet? Yep, brilliant. So yeah, so again, thanks, echo my thanks to Tamsin and KUK for organising this. I think this did come out of the last session that KUK organised about the accountability statements, when I think people were interested in the framework and wanted to know more about it. And so yeah, I was volunteered, I think, by Tamsin to go, yeah, of course, we should organise another session. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here to do that. And I've talked about it in a number of venues so far, and I think I think people are generally finding it helpful, and we have often having very good conversations around it. So hopefully we can stimulate a good discussion about it today as well. And you know, it's an attempt to try and bring together what is quite a complex picture into a simplish, not say simple, but simplish diagram and framework to try and articulate what you might call critical growth pathways from knowledge exchange from universities to economic growth, and think about those. So, and again, thanks to Rhys and Research England for commissioning this and for asking us to do it, and also for the introduction. So I'm talking about this document today. I think Tamsin's put in the chat, but you can use the QR code to download it if you want to. And just echoing the comment that Tamsin and Rhys have both also made, these are my comments and my views and the views based on this work. Well, I cannot speak for Research England when I answer any questions or this, right? This is our take on the system. So with that in mind, I think I just want to start with some reflections on, I guess, why we need a strong and healthy university knowledge exchange base. Right? I think we first have to recognise, and I think Rhys has made this point, that economic growth has become a critical imperative for the UK, but also for many other nations. Right? Our ability to innovate, the entrepreneurial dynamism of our economy are known to be critical drivers of long-run economic growth. We also know that solutions to many of the challenges that we face as society across the country are going to require advances in science and technology, as well as understanding of behaviours of socio-political systems and things like that. Now, advancing and developing these solutions will require much more integration of research, solutions-focused translation and development, workforce development, thinking about how systems need to transform and change. And these are going to require insights coming together from lots of different disciplines, not just from science and technology. So just making this case right up front that it's not just about STEM-driven stuff. This is across the disciplinary portfolio. How do we bring together insights from lots of different places to develop solutions to problems that we face? We know that universities have really important roles to play as well in regional growth, but also in the adoption and diffusion of technologies. Again, trying to get beyond this notion that universities are primarily about the frontier of innovation and things like that. No, we know that there's lots of evidence that universities contribute both to kind of generating ideas and inventions and innovations, but also helping companies, for example, to adopt the latest technologies and things like that. We know that delivery in these areas is going to require capabilities to come together from across the ecosystem. A single university, even groups of universities, can't do it alone, but equally industry can't do it on its own as well. And we have to come together. So again, this case for knowledge exchange being absolutely crucial element of how we find solutions to this, how we advance economic growth is, I think, K is really important. We're also seeing the rise of different types of funders. Think ARIA, think philanthropy, I think is becoming an interesting case. I think certainly in the States is rising relatively rapidly, and I think we're starting to see that here as well. But also traditional funders are evolving. So if you just look at, Valence's 3 and 4 buckets, how that's now cascading down to UKRI, new people in post in different bits of the system, we are seeing changes. And that is going to have implications for how universities and others behave and the kind of funding that they can bid for, and how they the kind of expectations, I guess, on them. So all of this is creating significant pressures and expectations on universities and their partners to work together, to deliver more, to deliver faster, all against, I think we need to recognize the huge financial pressures universities face and the university sector faces. But I also wanted to make that point on the slide that it's also against the backdrop of, I think, waning public support for universities. Why do we put so much money into universities? Which then brings us to, I'll say a little bit about it later on. How do we convince people that this is the right thing to do? This is worth the investment. And we're not particularly good at telling those stories, I think, and generating evidence in a way that can convince people outside this domain that the investments are worth it. So again, yeah, and this I firmly believe that knowledge exchange is an absolute crucial part of the answer to this. So I guess given all this kind of backdrop, this kind of context, it's no surprise for me that DCIT is becoming increasingly clear over the last couple of years that they were going to ask Research England to focus HIFE on kickstarting growth or kind of being a key part of the growth agenda. So as Rhys mentioned, to support their efforts to do this, Research England asked us to think through where and how universities, through their knowledge exchange efforts, can contribute to economic growth. The focus was very much to develop a framework to help unpack what I think can be quite an abstract and nebulous concept. Say, invest to drive growth. Well, how, right? So identify critical growth pathways, critical growth drivers, and particularly focus on where we can and should expect to see contributions from universities. They also, and if you read the report, there's also a lot of an attempt in there to try and think through what success could look like, and also how we might evidence that success at the program level. I'll say a bit more about that later on. Note that the ask, again, just echoing this thing, the ask from us was very much to focus on how universities through KE can drive growth and contribute to the growth agenda, not specifically how HIFE enables that to happen. And the framework that we developed is very much builds on a lot of work that's been done in this space. There's a lot published in various places that can inform this agenda. I've done bits of it. Other people have done quite a lot as well. So it was an attempt to try and bring together this wealth of insight that isn't quite fragmented, but to try and bring together in a coherent way. And crucially, I think we wanted the framework, and you'll see that when I present it, it doesn't speak to any particular type of knowledge exchange interaction mechanism. Right? It's very much agnostic to the how you deliver the knowledge exchange or the kinds of mechanisms that enable the contributions to be realized. And that's very much going in the spirit of HIFE, right? You, the universities, are the best place, and their partners are the best place to decide exactly how, right? So, but this is more about saying, where do we expect to see contributions? How might it all fit together? And as we said, the framework informed RE's updated policies and priorities for HIFE. So, onto the framework. So I just want to talk a bit about, I guess, how we developed and try and build it up in stages and how we started to develop it. So in doing these kind of things, I always like to try and start with the ultimate goal. So if we're trying to develop if we're trying to drive economic growth, how do we start unpacking that and unpacking it into drivers and pathways and things like that? So what do we mean when we talk about economic growth, and how do we Tamsin? Yeah.
Sorry, Thomas, I don't know if everyone's, we can't see your diagram at the moment. I think it's possibly coming through quite slowly, but I can't see my
Has it come? Can you see an economic growth box at the bottom?
Yes. Is that intentional?
That's intentional, yes.
Okay, super. Okay, I just wanted to check because it looked like three.
All you should be able to see now is 3 grey boxes and a green box in the bottom right-hand corner.
Fantastic. Good.
Brilliant.
Just
okay, it's going to slowly unravel. If you can't see boxes or they're completely out of sync, just let me know again, okay?
Brilliant. So, okay, sorry, carry on.
No, all good. Good to know. So I'm going to basically walk through the diagram slowly so it doesn't look too complicated right from the get-go. So basically, we started with what we want to try and achieve, which is universities contributing to the growth agenda. So in thinking through what we mean by growth, there's a lot of empirical evidence, a lot of theory which suggests that over the long run, economic growth is driven by increases in productivity. And then within the productivity side of things, increase in productivity has driven a strong role for science and innovation, also for skills and things like that. But we also know that in the UK, hopefully now you can see that next box popping up. So in the UK, in the shorter run, right now, we face some big issues around participation. Too many people are not in the labour market for lots of different reasons, whether that's mental and physical health issues, whether it's a lack of suitable opportunities, difficulties in accessing the labour market, or whatever it might be. So too many people are not in the labour market contributing productively to the economy, and we also have productivity issues as well. So if we then think through about what might drive productivity and participation, you can adopt different lenses, but we decided to adopt a useful lens to look at these issues was around competitiveness. Right? So how can we become more competitive as places, as sectors, as organizations? And then kind of taking the analogy a bit into the people, about how can we become more competitive, I guess, as people, in terms of sort of driving productivity and increasing our ability to participate in the labour market. Thinking about that both in terms of domestically, are we competitive domestically, but are we also competitive globally as well? So then thinking about about competitiveness of places, sectors, people, organizations. The government's industrial strategy focuses heavily on frontier industries. And I completely get it, right? I think it's incredibly important that we think about how we can ensure that we can compete globally in those industries that will power the future. Right? So I get it, and then we really need to think about how we drive those and we can compete globally, particularly in those industries, and which bits of the value chain things that. But we also need to think about today, and I think this might come up as a common theme in this framework, is yes, we need to think about the future, but the transition matters a lot, right? So we have to think about what we've got today and how we strengthen that as well while we're thinking about the future as well. So in doing so, I think you need to think a lot about the legacy industries that we have, the big industries that we have today, those industries that employ a lot of people, whether that's nationally or in regions. And they often face huge innovation challenges, big productivity challenges. So how can we help to strengthen innovation that's likely to be more incremental around products, processes, business models, for example, to help them increase their productivity, to sustain or recover competitive advantage, for example, to keep employing those people. And one argument is that if you can even shift the dial on these big employment generators in the economy, you might be able to shift productivity quite significantly, particularly regionally, but also nationally as well. So yes, frontier, but also legacy industries too. Then I'm also quite passionate that any growth framework thinks about supporting those organizations that are important for delivering public services. And they might be in the private, the public, or the third sector that provide these key public services that are often required for companies to operate effectively, for people to ensure they're healthy and they can get to work and they can educate their children, all this kind of stuff. So for us to participate effectively in the labour market and for companies to operate and compete, we need effective public services as well. So for me, seeing public service delivery in an effective and efficient way is kind of part of a growth story as well. And we know that a lot of work that happens in universities is also partly shaped at driving innovation and improvements in public, or has the potential to drive innovation and improvements in public services too. And of course, each of those have their sector-specific structures and value chains, life cycles, opportunities and challenges. So in some ways, we really need to understand where we want to try and have an effect, to then understand the pathways into delivering those effects. Into the universities, we can think of universities having, don't want to get too academic, but kind of bundles of resources and capabilities that if you bring them together in certain types of way, focus them on solving a problem, they can generate valuable things, working in partnership with others often. And we can think of obviously the research portfolios, which might be different types of disciplines, but also phases of the research life cycle, from perhaps more curiosity driven to more applied, more problem driven, to the education and learning portfolio, to the facilities, equipment, data, tools that universities often have either within their institutions or with partners, the people that inhabit the university who often have built up unique and valuable knowledge and expertise, but who also have valuable social and professional networks that both extend into different types of organizations, into different sectors, perhaps into their region, but also across the UK and internationally. So the people, we often say the people are at the heart of an organization, thinking about what kind of unique and expertise the people hold. And of course, then the support and the resources that are available within a university to support and enable the delivery of knowledge exchange. So obviously the K professionals, any other resource that can be brought to bear to make it work. So within this kind of like general framing of the challenge, we then isolated 4 critical growth pathways through which universities, through their knowledge exchange activities, can contribute to the growth agenda. And this, we'll start with the one that everybody talks about at the moment, is very high profile at the moment, around commercializing ideas and knowledge and technologies to create new opportunities and new sources of wealth. Okay, most high profile thing, I guess, at the moment is around spin-outs, but not just around spin-outs. So how can we commercialize frontier ideas and knowledge and things like that to open up new sources of economic wealth? There's a load of evidence to show that a lot of knowledge exchange is also about helping companies but I'm deliberately call them refer to organizations here because it's not just companies, charities, hospitals, local government, whoever it might be, to solve problems, to think about how we can strengthen their ability to innovate, compete, and then there's a huge emphasis on scaling in the UK for the benefit of the UK. If you look at the evidence and the literature and the kind of the policy framing around innovation over the last 20 or 30 years, a big emphasis has been on not just about helping individual organizations, but how do you strengthen the system within which those organizations operate. So we can think here about the resources and conditions of the system that companies and others have available to them, for example, around skills or access to finance or infrastructure, whether that's translation infrastructure or innovation infrastructure. We can think about the culture of the area of the system, for example, around innovation or entrepreneurship and stuff. We can think about the rules, what we might call the rules of the game, the institutions. So that's the policies, the legal framework, the regulations, the standards, and things like that. And we can also think about the capabilities that exist at the system level. So that might be a region or a sector to actually set directions, to help create visions, to create strategies for guiding resource allocation and things like that. So thinking about how do we power ecosystems and by strengthening the growth drivers, by easing bottlenecks to drive the competitiveness of a place, of a sector, for example. And then for me, the last dimension, the last critical growth pathway is one that often gets, I think, overlooked or is kind of implicit in a lot of these models, but we're very keen to make it much more explicit, particularly given the participation problems that we face in the UK at the moment. And that's very much around the people, right? How do we enable people to participate productively in the economy, right? And I think particularly given the issues that we face at the moment. And that's not just about skills. And when I've presented this before, somebody said, well, where's skills in this diagram? I was like, well, it's kind of in there, right? But actually, it's not just about skills. It's about things like mindset, ambition, empowerment, access to the labor market. It's about health and well-being of individuals so they can, right? So for me, it's a broader set of things about how do you help people, where skills is an important dimension, component of that, but not necessarily the only component of it. So in each of these layers and with each of these sectors, universities have a lot to contribute, as I think Reece also mentioned, by working directly with partners to help them solve a problem, spinning out companies, licensing technology, and things like that. But there's also a lot more that might be more indirect, right? Particularly when you get to thinking about more outcomes driven or thinking about the specific growth pathways, where the mechanism of KE doesn't really tell you what's being delivered. So I can imagine that a lot of universities represented on this call are probably doing work on, I don't know, how do you labor market flexibility and how to improve labor market conditions, or social interventions to reduce homelessness and improve opportunities for work, or things like that, for example, or regulatory standards in a certain context to unlock the ability to, I don't know, regulate AI or novel therapeutics or something. And so that research is tackling, potentially opening up a certain bit of the pathway or contributing to one of those pathways, which will require some kind of knowledge exchange to help get it out, to find the partners that might be able to help, deploy that in the real world, to make the change, to see that change enacted, right? It's not going to be the university doing it directly, but it's them helping other people to see what's possible, to design interventions and things like that. So again, thinking about what's direct, but also what's indirect and enabled by knowledge exchange, and then might hit different pathways. And of course, so given that, I think for me, this the point about this, the framework is kind of agnostic to the ways that the types of knowledge exchange that you deliver, that can be delivered. Is that I think there is some alignment, broadly speaking, but actually different types of knowledge exchange can probably hit each of those pathways, whether that's collaborative and contract research, whether that's spin-outs and licensing, whether that's training, facilities access and things like that, consultancy, networks and stuff. So that broadly is the framework. And so broadly speaking, it's kind of universities and partners working together through knowledge exchange to contribute to strengthening the economic system in different ways to create and capture value and to impact competitiveness, productivity and growth. Broadly speaking, 3 big buckets. I'm trying to think about the outcomes you want to achieve, the mechanisms by which that might happen, and then what you draw upon within the university to enable that. So I'm going to talk about another 10 minutes, then we'll stop and we'll sort of open up for questions and stuff. Just to talk a bit about, in a bit more detail, about what we think success could look like. So trying to make it a bit more tangible, right? And so actually, when we try to consider each of those layers, what could some success statements look like? And these are work in progress. I think these are, but again, so feedback and thoughts would be very much welcome. And I think this was actually arguably the more challenging bit that Research England set us. when asking for this framework. They said, yeah, framework, yes, but how do we know if it's working? So what we tried to do is to say, think about success statements at the program level. And I think this is quite important. This is not about an individual university, because again, each university knows much more about how it can contribute and where it can contribute. This is about saying across all those in receipt of high funding, doing knowledge exchange, how can at the system level, how do we know if there's change happening that can be linked back to knowledge exchange? And then you can then try and identify whether the funding is playing a role. So, and I believe that's complementing the request that Research England is making through the accountability statements for more university specific indicators of progress, and how the universities will monitor progress and know that they're making a difference. So I said our effort here was trying to identify statements of success, mindful of where we can and should expect universities to contribute and where they might be able to have some influence. So I think trying to say, oh, let's measure GDP, effects on GDP. Well, it's just not going to happen, right? It's just there's too many other things that have to happen for that to too many other things that could disrupt it along the way as well. And this very much links that comment on the right hand side of the screen by very respected academics in a report for the European Commission that talks about, for these indicators to be insightful and actionable, they need to be sufficiently responsible and attributable to the intervention. And I think we very much adopt that approach, which is going back over the work we've done on knowledge exchange for many years. That's the idea of trajectory measures, of thinking about what's within the line of sight of a university and its the effects of what it's doing, rather than trying to go, let's try and measure ultimately number of jobs created and GVA and things like that. So within the first dimension, and these are just lifted from the report, around commercialization, around taking ideas and knowledge and technologies and trying to open up new sources of economic wealth. We should expect university commercialization, wider KE efforts, not just about spin-outs, could support new technologies and knowledge developed within universities being developed into applications by private, public, third sector organizations. Again, I don't think it, for me, necessarily matters whether it's a private sector or a public organization that's taking it up. And they're gaining some kind of traction, whether it's commercial traction. We're seeing them being deployed. So not just it's out there, but can we see people use them? The innovations based on inventions and knowledge developed within universities are gaining widespread adoption within a sector and within a society. You might say that's more of a systemic, longer-term benefit. Do we see widespread change and widespread adoption of the ideas coming out of universities? Do we see inventions and knowledge developed within universities that unlock significant new fields of application and innovation? You do see that sometimes. And that's almost transformative potentially. And if you only focus on the initial thing, the initial invention, you might massively underestimate the long-term effect. So do we see it opening up new opportunities almost for whole new fields of innovation? In terms of the organization layer, whether it's companies or other organizations, and helping them to innovate, compete, deliver services and things like that, that through their knowledge exchange activities with universities, we would hope that these organizations are more innovative, more productive, more competitive, particularly in the context of the private sector, both domestically and internationally, that they're able to scale their operations in the UK, anchoring greater value for UK benefit. They have increased their efforts to develop and adopt innovation to increase productivity and competitiveness. They have a stronger resource base to innovate and compete in the market, so we can think about their skills, so it might be through training, for example, they improve their skills, their facilities or access to facilities, their tools, their equipment to innovate, the networks they have available to them, the funding, the IP, other intangibles. How can universities help the companies to improve these? Do they have better strategic capabilities to make better, more strategic decisions, whether that's at the managerial level, the leadership, to identify opportunities, how they might go after them, the challenges they might face, in the collaborative capabilities of these organizations, the production capabilities of these organizations. So thinking about the sets of capabilities and resources that these organizations have available to them, which we know drives their competitive position, their ability to drive value. At the people layer, this was an interesting one to try and think about. Through efficient and effective K between universities and their partners, we would hope to expect to see reductions in the skills gaps, for example, facing industry and the public sector. I think in thinking about these things, we need to be careful about where we draw boundaries. So it's perhaps not across everything, But if we know where they're trying to make a difference and the scale of effort, then we would hope to see some change there, right? That individuals engaging with universities for the purpose, say, of professional development, where they're engaging with them to receive some kind of training capacity, we would hope they would become more productive and competitive in the labour market. That universities are working to, and we're seeing them enhance the opportunities available for productive and fulfilling work. And that can be through, and particularly with hard to reach communities, and that can be through, for example, apprenticeships, and there's a lot talked about at the moment, or internships, but as well as things like providing local leadership and inspiration, and how do we help, and then also perhaps more support to help people back to work, support to help improve people's mental health and well-being. There's a whole angle on students rising up the agenda incredibly quickly particularly around the student entrepreneurship side. But do students have the skills, knowledge, mindsets, and behaviors necessary to transform ideas into action? And I'm using deliberately slightly vague language there, whether that's an idea that ends up as a venture that's creating commercial value, or that's an idea that's implemented through some other means that helps to transform a community or a policy or something like that, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be through ventures, but again, students taking their ideas and converting them into things that can make a change in the context of growth. So again, lots of different areas where we think change could be seen. And then this last layer around powering ecosystems, I realized the title's slightly different on the top of that screen. I was trying to improve the language here a bit. But again, through effective and efficient K between universities and their partners, seeing increased availability and accessibility of key resources that organizations need to innovate and compete and scale. So I think here, in the local area, do companies have access to a more aligned set of skills, a labor market they can tap into? Do they have more infrastructure or more support and access to finance that's more aligned to their needs? But then crucially, not just do they have it available, can they access it? So we're thinking both about availability and also access and the barriers that might exist in that. And there's various surveys which show the kind of barriers that companies face. Are regions better able to seed, attract, and retain and scale innovative companies? Are they able to attract inward investment for R&D and early stage innovation into the UK, its nations, regions, and sectors? And we're seeing universities start to play a much more active role in these kind of spaces. Do we see new and stronger innovation-led and entrepreneurial clusters around universities forming? And again, some universities are making that kind of play. So can we see that happening? Can we see that emerging? And two more slides, I promise, not much more. And then I guess continue on from this as well, more on the institutions and the strategic capabilities of that side of this layer. Do we see national in the institutions? So think here policies, legal frameworks, regulations, standards, procurement process, and all that kind of stuff, being influenced and shaped by ideas and knowledge developed within universities. And here, for example, there are various data sets now. I think we can try and track the policy impacts, for example, of academic research, where you're doing research into these kind of things. Where knowledge exchange might be incredibly important to engage with the policymakers and funders and others, the regulatory bodies, to try and ensure they have, that they can find new ways of delivering their interventions. That we have stronger capabilities at the system level, whether that's the place or a sector, for example, to develop and implement strategies to guide the allocation of resource. That might be a local growth strategy, for example. We know, again, universities are often heavily engaged with their local, so mayoral authorities or local government or growth bodies and things like that. So how are they working and contributing to that kind of activity? Critical in this kind of space of how we drive growth and innovation is we do not know really what works across all areas. So experimentation becomes really important. And it's not just experimenting, but we have to then be willing to learn from that. And we have to be able to have the facility to scale those experiments that are successful. So can we see evidence of experimentation, but also evidence of learning and those successful things being rolled out more broadly? And then for me, again, it's a system, right? So by doing all of this, do we see stronger universities that over time are better able to deliver these kind of contributions? And we've seen that over the last 15, 20 years. So do we see that continuing into the future? So with that, that's kind of the kind of success statements. I'm just going to end with a couple of reflections, then I'll open up for comments. So just very much in summary, I personally believe that there's a lot that we have an absolutely critical role to play the K community in the growth agenda. And there's huge pressures now for universities to adapt, deliver more, deliver faster. against this backdrop of huge financial pressures, but also waning public support for universities. And I think also potentially increasing competition for funding. And that's maybe a whole thing we might see over the next few years. We've identified 4 critical growth drivers that hopefully provides a bit of structure to talk about this. And crucially, different universities will play in different spaces. There's absolutely no expectation, I think, that all universities are going to try and hit all of those pathways across all of those sectors, right? And actually, if you look at the number of pathways, and you look at the number of sectors and bits of value chains and regions and local economies and national economies and things like that, there are many areas which need help where universities, I think, can contribute. So again, the diversity of the sector is its strength. And how do we ensure that we're all contributing in the ways in which we can to these different areas? And then going back to that point about the waning public support, I think we really need to get a lot better at telling the story and evidencing the story in ways that can convince people that this is worth continuing to invest in. So I've talked for a long time. I'm going to stop there. And yeah, very, very happy to answer any questions about the framework, about what we were thinking and things like that. And yeah, again, if it strays into what hype and fun, that's not, I won't be able to say much. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Thomas. That was a great dip into the report. And we do have 3 questions or a couple of observations as well, kind of questions / observations in the Q&A, which I'll let you have a look at, which do relate partly to Hive, but specifically to how our audience does use this framework when they're trying to articulate the value of Hive. And I know in the report you go on to talk more about potential data sources, and that's something we touched on in our earlier discussions, so that might be something we want to pick up on. But I think one thing that really stood out for me reading the report is that it is a complex scenario, this, isn't it? We know this. We know that there are so many inputs to knowledge exchange, people, funding, different kinds of resources. And there are, equally complex number of potential outputs. And so the framework is intended to be just one way in which you might see your way to this word pathways, I think is important. So whether that's looking in hindsight at how an output has occurred and you figuring out a pathway to how you got there, or whether, I know many universities now are starting to think about that next phase of KE activity and how you more proactively say this is where we're planning to focus our resources with the intention that we will achieve these outcomes. And I think I'm right in saying that you are also supportive that it shouldn't necessarily be uniquely financial outcomes, that there are important social benefits which are described within that overall framework of economic growth. And I think the beginning of the report is very useful into just explaining what economic growth is and the different facets which relate to organisations, people, society, productivity in different ways. So yeah, I think it is complicated, and it's a more difficult approach, I think in some ways to that logic model where you go A, B, C, D, but which misses so much of the richness.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think for me, just to comment on a couple of those things. So the just saying that last bit, I mean, logic models are kind of behind all this, right? It's not, but for me, a logic model needs to have a conceptual framing that sits above it. So a logic model basically says there's inputs, there's activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts, right? And actually, I don't quite like the outcomes and impacts. I think it's too difficult to disentangle. So there's a slightly different conceptualization of that in the report, which talks about direct benefits and more systemic and capacity building, behavioral change, and then more system-wide systemic benefits as well. So, but the point about this framework, I've just seen some of the comments as well, is that it's trying to provide some, what was the word I used in a previous discussion? A bit of an architecture, it's kind of like a scaffolding about to have a discussion about how the activities of universities through knowledge exchange activities of universities can fit into a growth narrative. How do we think these feed through into growth? Now, ultimately, it should also identify those things that maybe don't fit into a growth narrative as well. But there have been lots of cases over the last few years, in particular, when it's kind of been more and more obvious that we need to focus heavily on growth because of the problems we've faced in this country for many years, and effectively global competitiveness. Where does the UK sit in the world? We didn't like, people were talking about what they were doing, And I could see this journey. And you go, well, actually, of course, that's an important component of the growth of a growth agenda, but they couldn't see it. And so when Research England was I guess tasked by DSIT to align HIFE with kickstarting economic growth, this challenge of saying, actually, well, if you just say invest to drive growth, it's too nebulous a concept, and you have to then start unpacking it. So one of the comments was about actually the infrastructure, the HIFE infrastructure categories, for example, which was what I did about 15 years ago now, crikey. That's more about what you do internally to enable K to happen. And I agree that there's a now challenge about how do you start aligning some of these things. And yes, there's a misalignment at the moment potentially. But the point about this was actually saying, actually, once you've done that, as you're doing the K, or looking outwards in terms of the outcomes you might expect to see, how can we talk about the outcomes in a way that is part of a growth narrative, is helping to understand maybe you focus things a bit more. So it helps, how do you build competitiveness of people, places, organizations, and things like that, in order to drive productivity, participation, and ultimately to drive growth. Now, completely agree that it's not all about financials, right? When we were challenged to try and think about potential indicators, actually that was the hardest bit. The success data was tricky, but actually the potential indicators was incredibly challenging because we don't have great data sets, really. We have more than a lot of other nations, but we still don't have great data sets. But there was a lot when you started digging into these data sets. So again, beyond the income that universities receive and things like that, which I agree doesn't help you. It's a valuable. I will still defend that it's a valuable indicator, but it doesn't help you tell a story about how universities drive growth. So if you're then challenging and say, well, how can Research England demonstrate is knowledge exchange for universities, is high funding enabling it to drive specific types of or growth and how it does that? You're then trying to move beyond income because you really need to know how, right? Which bits of it is it affecting? But then you get into the various national data sets, right? Surveys of companies, surveys of individuals, surveys or your data collected, where you kind of go, if only we could add one tag where it said, did you work with a university in some kind of way? It's student outcomes, right? Did you as a student engage in, benefit for or engage in some kind of knowledge exchange activity? You might define what they might be. Suddenly, you've then got the potential to link that to the outcomes of those, whether it's a labor force survey, or whether it's the innovation survey of companies or students. And so some of what we were trying to do in the indicator side, actually saying, if we could in a scenario where we could, change, like influence these surveys in a tiny way, we could then potentially have quite rich sets of insights into the outcomes. I engage university and this is what happened to an individual or a company or a system. One of the hardest bits to evidence, I think, is the ecosystem level. Yeah. And we've talked about this before, and we know that universities do a lot of work with whether it's their local area, places like Manchester with their mayoral authorities, even at the national level. And the aim is to build and strengthen an ecosystem. So what does success look like for that? And how do then you measure whether there's been change, there's maturing, for example, there's strengthening that ecosystem? So again, trying to think through how that might happen, and I don't have great answers to that at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that one of the values of KE is that it often is the convening power for these conversations between the multiple partners that ultimately need to work together to create that economic growth, and to identify the opportunities that might be applicable. It's that juncture between the supply side, you might say, and the demand side. Although it's not always clear which is supply and which is demand, actually, is it? And often, the convener can come down to a particular individual at a particular organisation. And so investing in that individual is as important as the activity that they are ultimately doing. So it is difficult, and it's hard to justify when, there are so many demands on our funding, and you're looking at mission-led growth, and it's like, well, that doesn't map neatly onto this mission, but it might underpin something which you can relate to a mission. And I think the Q&A is showing that people are, trying to see how they can use this framework in quite a specific way, whereas I think the message was that this is, use the scaffolding, which I think is a good, it's helping to suggesting ways in which you might articulate a narrative, but it's not going to provide the narrative right at this moment. I think it's another step forward in how we might talk about KE in 2-3 years' time, and indeed we might see those categories, those, you know, the categories you developed about 15, 20 years ago, change, or at least develop, become more, you know, more nuanced perhaps. And somebody, you know, has put in a comment about AI. Yes, there may be a way that we can deploy AI to help, you know, you know, draw together multiple narratives around KE, but it's the success may lie in how we tell the story. And I think to pick up on another point about that's in the Q&A, I think some worked examples is probably possibly a next step that we can help to facilitate, you know, some worked examples using the framework and demonstrating how it could be used.
Completely. And I just want to pick up one thing, because yesterday, the thing I was at, where it was, you know, there's recognition that you know, standard things, right? The UK has a very strong university base and research base, and actually the big focus at the moment is there's a lot of attention on, you know, declining R&D spend by businesses, and, you know, arguably how do we scale business in the UK? How do we make businesses more innovative in the UK, right? And I think this is, you know, we always go back in that debate, oh, universities need to get better. It's like, hang on a second, businesses also need to get better as well.
Yeah.
And because you mentioned the supply and demand side, the debate has long, for, I mean, going back to Lambert's review in 2003, recognized that we need to, yes, think about the supply side. How do we strengthen universities to do more, do better, more efficient, and things like that, strengthen the outward links and that kind of stuff. But we also need to think about the demand side. And that, for me, that organization layer, how do we help companies and other organizations to innovate, is partly about building their capabilities, whether that's through training, whether that, if you have a partnership with them, helping them to think about how they can absorb what's happening through the partnership. But it's building up that capability within industry to actually innovate and to absorb ideas, to collaborate. And it might not be your ideas that come from your university, but helping to build that capability is still, for me, a massive contribution that universities can bring to the demand side of this equation, which then will hopefully lead to more innovative companies that can compete more effectively globally and things like that. So I think, again, it's thinking through these things. Again, it's hard to capture all this in a diagram, in a single diagram. And it is, I noticed one of the comments, it is unfortunately complex. And, you know, we can have goes at trying to make it more simple. And that's really important, that it ends up, and Research English had a go to try and create much simpler boxes with very simple language, which I think has been incredibly valuable exercise. Because again, you know, we sit in a university, we embedded in the academic literature and stuff, so we're trying our best. But again, trying to think through how you communicate this more effectively, I think, is actually really important. And then the case studies, I think we've had chats about this. You know, KUK is sitting on a wealth of examples and initiatives, from the K Awards to information you collect from institutions. How can we start hanging examples on this to bring it alive? I think is a really important, perhaps, next step.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely an action that we can take away and think about. Rhys, I don't want to put you on the spot, but is there anything you wanted to say in response to just a few of those questions that do have picked up on Hive, and maybe how this framework, expectations perhaps on how this framework might be used in the context of Hive accountability?
Yeah, so I think, as Thomas has said, in terms of the how the framework can help it, we see it as helping universities to think about their overall kind of package of activity strategically, and kind of what they're looking to achieve, the pathways to which they can achieve economic growth, and then Hive kind of fits within that to support some certain initiatives that kind of maybe best deliver those economic growth impacts and outputs. I mean, yeah, in response to some of the questions, I think just reiterate the point that it can be direct or indirect in terms of having that pathway. But if you've got the evidence that the pathway exists and it does kind of build towards that overall kind of outcome and impacts that we're aiming for, then, you know, that kind of makes it an eligible activity in itself. It's down to the institution to kind of think about what are the best way of utilizing their resources and their capabilities. If they have kind of expertise in a certain area, certain types of activities, then they can leverage that if they've got the evidence to show that that pathway is kind of clearly delivering towards that economic impact benefit.
Yeah, and I suppose if there's not, you know, a particularly robust data sets. I know in the Hive accountability webinars we talked about not disclosing long lists of KPIs, but if an institution has got
Yeah,
an activity going and saying, well, we don't quite have the data for this, but internally we're using this KPI, that at least is a starting point, isn't it? And it shows that the activity has been monitored and there will
yeah.
be a feedback loop at some point.
Exactly. I think that's part of the difficulty that's kind of been said already is, certain areas have kind of better or clearer metrics, but we want to ensure that we're kind of building the picture of kind of the broad depth of contributions that are provided by universities, and that there is a kind of wider scale than what we can really measure well at the moment. So part of this exercise, as you said, Tamsin, in terms of what we ask for from the accountability, we're not intending to kind of be rigorously more formally kind of holding you to certain KPIs. It's more about thinking about how do we together kind of develop better metrics in this space, be able to better evidence the different contributions that universities make. And that's a kind of long-term project, something that we're thinking about doing. Research England wanting to improve metrics in the knowledge exchange space. But I think, we've got to kind of balance that we want to kind of encourage you to balance that kind of exploratory thinking of, okay, well, we know that there is effects here, so we need to kind of try to find the metrics that support that, but also with the kind of having some element, some grounding in that your activity kind of, you're able to show that your activity is currently kind of supporting the growth narrative.
Yeah, fantastic.
Can I just add to that? Because
sure.
I've been reading some of the comments as well. And just to add to that, I think the reality is, at least from my perspective, sitting outside the policy system and observing, I guess, is that it's quite easy if you're commercializing technologies to develop a growth narrative. So I've seen some comments about public engagement, community engagement.
Yeah.
I think this is the challenge to those communities, is that unfortunately, for whatever reason, it is, we need to get better at telling those stories, at evidencing why, for example, public engagement or interventions from the arts and the cultural sector, and with healthcare, for example, how that is helping to deliver growth. And that, so the question is, how do we help? I think there's an interesting question for KUK, for us, for others, to help understand the extent to which those are viable growth pathways. And it's not hard to imagine how they might be. And I think one of the people in the chat mentioned that there is evidence about how it supports, granted indirectly, economic growth. Now, in some ways, I think the challenge is how do you communicate that, right? So don't say, I want to invest in X. I want to invest in X because it's going to deliver these kind of outcomes. I think don't want to say anything on behalf of researching, but I think that's the challenge, is help people understand how the thing you want to invest in situates within the government's ambition or the government's agenda. Because that, I think, is the reality, is that everything is, a lot of it is focused on growth at the moment. So we have to help the funders, help policymakers who are going to read these things, understand how what you want to do is going to help them achieve these kind of outcomes. So I think we're trying to, in the framework, provide a bit of a scaffolding. Again, other universities may have access to other evidence and insight that might help in other ways as well. So
and I think that evidence base and the narrative extends to working with the public and third sector, where there's a point just being put in the Q&A about how we know that the KTPs have had an impact on activity in that area. It can feel like a kind of non-commercial area, but of course we know the NHS is a prime example of where there is a tremendous amount of commercial potential. So, but it's often seen as a kind of poor cousin to working with a spin-out company or a more established R&D player. But we're seeing that there's not quite so much demand or quite so much engagement from that more commercial sector anyway. So I feel that is a circle that needs squaring at the moment. It's
very much so. And I think this is the real challenge at the moment, is, I guess, in trying to take growth and unpack it into productivity and participation, and then into these layers, particularly the people layer, but also to some extent the organisation layer. But the people layer is actually, I think, really, really important. If we want a productive labour force, they need to be healthy. They need to be have access to education and skills and transport and all these kind of things. Without that, we can't compete effectively as individuals. We can't access the labour market properly. We can't contribute at our best. So for me, again, these are all effectively growth stories, part of the growth story. And I think in some ways it's trying to help people understand that, because it's too easy, particularly with the more stuff that is much more indirect, right? Ultimately, we know that an attractive place to live with a cultural scene attracts people, attracts talent, attracts companies to want to locate to places. Now, but you have to help people understand why, I think, and that's the problem. It's too easy to go, oh, that's not eligible, because people don't have a lot of time. Most people are time poor in this kind of space. So I think we have to help people along that journey. But yeah, it's much harder if it's not very obvious.
I think giving higher profile to knowledge exchange in areas like education and social care, and it's as you said right at the top, we get a bit stuck around STEM-based commercialization, which can be deployed in public and third sectors as well, but it's often not a very diverse spread of models that we see and that really grab the headlines. So it comes back to that how we demonstrate that. We've got just a couple of questions left. There has been a question that's just links to the HESA GIS-K data model project. I'm guessing that the answer is this will all feed in that direction, but that is a slightly different conversation. And I know you're not directly connected.
Well, it depends which project we're talking about. So there's HESA's got a data modeling project to kind of map out HEBC at the moment. Right? They're doing that. We're talking with them about that as well. So there's some interaction with them. We've obviously got our own metrics project. That's part of our work with Research England, part of the KE metrics program. The things that the ideas and the insights that are captured in that report will be feeding to our ideas are from us as part of the Research England metrics program for KE in terms of how we might strengthen the HEBC data set. But again, for me, the report really challenged us to look at other data sets too, and say, actually, look, sometimes HEBC is not the right avenue to collect data on this, particularly if you want data on companies or people or things like that. It's just that you shouldn't be asking universities to report on that. So there'll be some things we need to be careful what we ask universities to provide in terms of data. We should also be looking for these other avenues too. So yeah, it will inform our work, which might then at some point lead to a change in a request for changes to HEBC. But
fantastic. So you've all got that to look forward to much further down the line. Right, it is 2 o'clock. So we will draw the conversation to a close there. We've got the questions on record, so if there are any thoughts subsequently on how to answer your questions, we will come back to you. We might also let you have a kind of transcript of the questions so you can see that. And if anybody does want to follow up, you can just get in touch with me at Knowledge Exchange UK, or I know Thomas is very easy to find as well, and I can always pass on questions to Research England as well. Rhys, was there any final comment you wanted to make before we go?
No, nothing in particular. Just hope that this has been kind of useful, and as you say, happy to kind of help if there are kind of questions. Happy to kind of be involved with responding to those and trying to. At the end of the day, I think it is a kind of cumulative effort. We're all kind of trying to work together to make the best outcome of this as possible.
Yeah.
So,
and I will emphasise that as I'm sure you all do know, the Research England KE team is a fantastically approachable and open team of people. So don't hesitate to get in touch with them. I'm going to say that on their behalf. So the channels are open. Right, we will let you go. We may reconvene to talk about Hive accountability once more before the final deadline. But in the meantime, I wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Rhys. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks very much. Cheers.